Welcome back to Naptime Knowledge. Take a slow breath in and let it go. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. Let the weight behind your eyes soften. Let the long accumulated weight of the day begin to dissolve from your body, the way morning frost dissolves in the first warmth of the sun. Slowly, without effort, simply because the warmth is there and the time is right. There is nothing left to do tonight. Whatever remains undone will still be there tomorrow, patient as stone, and you can attend to it then. Right now, the only thing asked of you is to breathe and to listen, and to let your mind be carried somewhere extraordinary. Breathe in and out. Tonight, we are going on a journey unlike most of the journeys we take on Naptime Knowledge. Most of our journeys go backward, deep into ancient history, into civilizations that rose and fell millennia before any of us were born. Tonight, we are going somewhere that many people alive right now can remember. Tonight, we are going to one of the most astonishing things the human race has ever done. We are going to the space race. Just breathe for a moment with that. The space race, the period from roughly 1957 to 1972. 15 extraordinary years. In those 15 years, human beings went from having never placed a single object in orbit to walking on the surface of the moon. From the first tentative beep of a small metal sphere tumbling through low Earth orbit to the boot prints of 12 human beings in the lunar dust. From the terrifying uncertainty of whether a rocket could survive the journey to orbit, to the almost incomprehensible act of pointing one at another world and landing it there, with human beings aboard, and bringing them home. It happened within living memory. And yet, it has the quality of myth. Let that settle for a moment. The quality of myth. Something too large, too extraordinary, to quite fit inside ordinary history. The engineers who built the rockets, the astronauts who flew them, the politicians who funded them, the mathematicians who calculated the trajectories, the seamstresses who sewed the spacesuits, the flight controllers who monitored every heartbeat and every fuel reading, all of them, every single one of them, participants in something that humanity had never done before, and that, in the specific form it took, has never been done again. Tonight, we are going to tell that story. Slowly, gently, chapter by chapter. Sleep will find you somewhere along the way. And when it does, let it come, carrying with it something of the awe and the wonder and the very human courage of the people who looked up at the moon and decided, against all reason and precedent, to go there. Breathe in and out. We are beginning. Chapter 1. The world before space. Why the race began. To understand the space race, you have to understand the world it was born into. That world was a world of fear. The Second World War had ended in 1945, leaving behind a devastation so total that the word unprecedented barely covers it. 60 to 80 million people had died. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. And in August of that year, 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan, introducing the world to a new category of weapon. one capable of destroying an entire city in a single moment, of killing 100,000 people before anyone had time to respond. The existence of the atomic bomb changed everything about international relations, about strategy, about the nature of power itself. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb. The United States was no longer the sole nuclear power. Two enormous, ideologically opposed nations, one a democracy, one a communist state, now both possessed weapons of unimaginable destruction, and they were hostile to each other in a way that made the ordinary management of international tension far more dangerous than it had ever been. This was the Cold War. Not a shooting war between the two superpowers themselves, but a sustained, decades-long confrontation of ideology and military power and technological competition, both sides watching the other with a fear and a wariness that never entirely relaxed. They built more bombs, then bigger bombs, then hydrogen bombs, hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. They built bombers to deliver them, and then missiles, and the missiles grew more powerful and more accurate and longer ranged, until by the mid-1950s, both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, mounted on rockets capable of reaching any point on the globe in less than 30 minutes. Let that breathe for a moment. It was in this atmosphere of existential fear, that the idea of space became significant. A rocket powerful enough to send a satellite into orbit was a rocket powerful enough to send a nuclear warhead to any city on Earth. Space was not separate from the arms race. It was continuous with it. And so, when the Soviet Union announced in the autumn of 1957 that it had successfully placed an artificial satellite in orbit around the Earth, the first time in human history that a human-made object had circled the planet, the reaction in the United States was not merely scientific curiosity. It was alarm. The satellite was called Sputnik. It weighed 83 kilograms and was roughly the size of a beach ball. It had no scientific instruments to speak of. It simply broadcast a radio signal, a steady beep, 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 that could be picked up by anyone with the right receiver. But that beep changed the world. Beep, 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 traveling overhead, every 96 minutes, circling the Earth twice a day. It said to anyone listening, "We got here first. We can do this. You cannot." The space race had begun. Chapter 2: Sputnik and the Shock of the Beep. The beep of Sputnik reached across the world. Radio operators in countries far from both the United States and the Soviet Union tuned in to hear it. That simple, regular pulse of radio waves orbiting the Earth once every 96 minutes, passing over every point on the planet twice a day. In Moscow, there was celebration. In Washington, there was something closer to crisis. The Eisenhower administration attempted to project calm. The president publicly downplayed Sputnik's significance, dismissing it as one small ball in the air. But privately, the reaction was more anxious. The military understood perfectly well what Sputnik meant. The rocket that had put Sputnik in orbit was directly derived from a missile designed to deliver a nuclear warhead to the continental United States. The shock deepened a month later On November 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, a much larger satellite, carrying the first living creature ever sent to space. Her name was Laika. She was a small mixed-breed dog, a stray found on the streets of Moscow, chosen for her calm temperament, trained for the experience of launch and weightlessness. She survived the launch and orbited the Earth, her vital signs monitored by sensors reporting back to ground stations. She died several hours after launch from overheating, a fact not publicly acknowledged by Soviet authorities for decades. The mission was always designed to be one way. The technology for safe recovery did not yet exist. Laika's mission carried a significance that has never quite resolved. She was a pioneer, the first living creature from Earth to orbit the planet, the first to experience weightlessness, the first whose physiological responses to spaceflight could be monitored in real time. And she died for it, alone, in a sealed capsule circling the Earth, in circumstances she could not have understood. Her image appeared on postage stamps across the Soviet Union. Children named toys after her. Breathe. The United States response was initially disastrous. In December 1957, the Navy attempted its own first satellite launch. The Vanguard rocket rose a single meter off the launch pad, lost thrust, fell back, and exploded in a fireball broadcast live on television. The Soviets offered American aid under the United Nations program for assistance to underdeveloped nations, a jibe that stung deeply. The American program needed a different approach. It found one in the army, and in a German rocket engineer named Wernher von Braun. Chapter 3. Wernher von Braun, the engineer who dreamed of space. Wernher von Braun is one of the most complicated figures in the history of spaceflight. A man of genuine genius and genuine complicity, whose biography contains both the extraordinary achievement of putting human beings on the moon and the deeply troubling fact of how he developed the skills that made that achievement possible. Von Braun was born in 1912 in Germany. He became obsessed with rocketry as a teenager after reading science fiction about space travel, and he pursued the obsession with single-minded intensity, studying engineering and physics, working with amateur rocket societies in the early 1930s. By the time the Nazis came to power, he was already one of the most talented young rocket engineers in the country, and the military quickly identified his work as having weapons potential. He became the technical director of the German 5V2 program, the development of the world's first operational ballistic missile, a weapon the Nazi regime used to bombard London and other Allied cities. The V2S were assembled at an underground factory called Mittelwerk, using slave labor from concentration camps. Thousands of workers died there, more, by some estimates, than were killed by the weapons the factory produced. Von Braun was aware of the conditions. He visited Mittelwerk. Let that sit quietly for a moment. At the end of the war, von Braun and many of his team surrendered to American forces, a deliberate choice made in the belief that the Americans offered the better prospects for continuing their rocket work. They were brought to the United States under a classified program called Operation Paperclip, which transferred former German rocket engineers to the American military establishment, overlooking or minimizing their wartime histories. In America, von Braun became something different. He became a dreamer, at least publicly. He wrote a series of articles for Collier's magazine, describing, in vivid technical detail, how humanity could go to space. A space station in Earth orbit, a mission to the moon, eventually a mission to Mars. The articles were read by millions. He appeared on television in a series of Disney programs, explaining to American families why the exploration of space was both possible and important. He became the public face of the American dream of space. When the Soviet Sputnik shock created urgent political demand for an American satellite, von Braun's team delivered. On January 31st, 1958, the Explorer 1 satellite was launched, and it worked. America was in space, and the scientific instruments aboard Explorer 1 made the first great scientific discovery of the space age, the detection of the Van Allen radiation belts, the zones of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field, encircling the planet in great invisible arcs. The race was on in earnest. Chapter 4. Mercury, the first Americans in space. Take a slow breath here. In 1958, the United States created a new civilian agency to manage the space program, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The first American human spaceflight program was called Mercury, after the swift messenger of the Roman gods, an appropriate name for the project of putting a human being into space as quickly as possible. NASA selected 7 military test pilots to be the first American astronauts. They were introduced to the public in April 1959 with a breathless press conference that made them instant celebrities. Not merely pilots, symbols of American courage, American capability, American determination. The 7 men, Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton, became the Mercury 7. But before any American reached orbit, the Soviet Union struck again. On April 12, 1961, a 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a spherical capsule called Vostok 1 and was launched into orbit around the Earth. He completed one orbit, 108 minutes. He re-entered the atmosphere, ejected from the capsule at 7 kilometers altitude, and parachuted to a landing in a field in the Soviet Union, where a startled farmer and her daughter watched a man in a bright orange spacesuit descend from the sky. Gagarin became, overnight, the most famous person on Earth. A genuine hero. He was charming, genuinely modest, and possessed of a quality of simple delight in what he had done that made him impossible not to like. His smile, broad and uncomplicated and joyful, appeared on posters and news covers everywhere. The United States response came 3 weeks later, on May 5, 1961, when Alan Shepard became the first American in space, a 15-minute suborbital flight, reaching an altitude of 187 kilometers, before splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a significant achievement. It was also emphatically not what Gagarin had done. Shepard had gone up and come back down. Gagarin had orbited the Earth. Everyone knew the difference. But 5 days before Shepard's flight, something else had happened that would set the course of the next decade. Chapter 5. Kennedy's Commitment. We choose to go to the moon. On May 25, 1961, 18 days after Alan Shepard's 15-minute spaceflight, at a time when the United States had a total of 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the nation to the moon. "I believe that this nation should commit itself," he said, "to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." The room received these words with a standing ovation. And then, when the applause died down, the people in that room had to begin thinking about what it would actually take to do what had just been promised. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was vast. In 1961, no one knew what rocket would be needed. No one knew how to navigate to the moon and back. No one knew how to land on a body with no atmosphere. No one knew whether human beings could survive the radiation environment of deep space. No one had built a life support system capable of keeping a human alive in the vacuum for the time required. The entire Apollo program in the spring of 1961 was nothing but a presidential promise and an enormous amount of work that no one knew how to do. By the time Kennedy delivered his more famous version, the speech at Rice University in September 1962, the work was well underway. And yet, even then, it remained, by any reasonable measure, an almost impossible undertaking. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Let that phrase drift through your mind for a moment. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The budget required was extraordinary. At its peak, the Apollo program consumed 4% of the entire federal budget of the United States. 400,000 people worked on it at its peak. Engineers and scientists and technicians and managers and seamstresses and machinists and test pilots and flight controllers spread across the country in a network of contractors and NASA facilities, all working toward the same destination: the moon. Chosen not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Chapter 6. John Glenn and the Friendship 7. America reaches orbit. Breathe. Before Apollo could be contemplated, Mercury had to be completed. And before Mercury could demonstrate American competence in human spaceflight, someone had to orbit the Earth. That someone was John Glenn. And on February 20th, 1962, he became the first American to do it. Glenn was, of the Mercury 7, perhaps the most naturally suited to the role of public hero. He was steady, thoughtful, deeply religious, and possessed of an integrity that people around him found completely authentic rather than performed. The flight of Friendship 7 was not without its anxieties. In the early orbits, a warning light suggested that the heat shield, the critical protection that would prevent the capsule from burning up on re-entry, might have come loose. Flight controllers debated in real time. They decided to have Glenn re-enter with the retro-rocket package still attached, which might help hold the heat shield in place. They told Glenn to do this without fully explaining why. Glenn figured out what they were worried about. He re-entered, and anyway, the heat shield held. He splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean after 3 orbits and 4 hours and 56 minutes in space. New York gave him a ticker-tape parade attended by 4 million people. He addressed a joint session of Congress. What Glenn's flight did was not merely technical. It changed something in the national atmosphere. America had an astronaut who had orbited the Earth. The program continued, each flight longer, more ambitious, more confident than the last, each one building the knowledge and the institutional confidence that Apollo would require. But while Mercury was flying, the Soviets were still ahead. They put the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, who orbited the Earth 48 times in June 1963. They performed the first spacewalk, Alexei Leonov, floating free of his capsule in March 1965, tethered to the outside of Voskhod, 2 for 12 minutes, looking at the Earth from outside any protective shell. He almost didn't make it back in. His spacesuit had inflated in the vacuum, making it too stiff to fit through the hatch. He had to vent some of the suit pressure to re-enter, a decision made in a few terrifying minutes while his life hung in the balance. The Soviets were still ahead, but Apollo was coming. Chapter 7. Gemini, Learning to Fly. Between Mercury and Apollo, there was Gemini, a bridge program, often overlooked in the popular memory of the space race, but absolutely essential to everything that Apollo required. Gemini flew 10 crewed missions between 1965 and 1966. And in those 20 months, it taught NASA almost everything it needed to know about human spaceflight, beyond the basics of getting up and getting back down. The Gemini capsule was larger than Mercury, carrying 2 astronauts. The missions were designed not merely to survive in space, but to do things there. Things that Apollo would need: rendezvous and docking, the ability of 2 spacecraft to find each other in orbit and connect, essential for the moon landing approach NASA had chosen. Spacewalking, the ability of an astronaut to leave the spacecraft in a spacesuit and work in the vacuum, maneuvering, controlling the rendezvous, approaching another vehicle. Long duration, the ability of human beings to survive in space for up to 2 weeks without serious degradation of health or performance. The spacewalking turned out to be harder than expected. Gemini astronauts performing EVA found themselves quickly exhausted, unable to complete their planned tasks, struggling with the physics of maneuvering in vacuum, where there was no friction and every action produced an equal and opposite reaction that sent you tumbling. They learned, they adapted, they installed better handrails and foot restraints, they changed the training, and eventually they learned the techniques that would allow the Apollo moonwalkers to work productively on the lunar surface. 16 astronauts flew on Gemini. Among them were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The crew, though none of them knew it yet, of Apollo 11. The pieces were coming together. Apollo was almost ready. And then, on a January evening in 1967, the program changed forever. Chapter 8. The Fire. Apollo 1. A slow breath here. January 27th, 1967. Cape Kennedy, Florida. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. 3 men sitting in the Apollo 1 command module, 3 weeks away from what was planned to be the first crewed Apollo mission, running a launch rehearsal test. They had been in the capsule for hours. At 6:31 in the evening, a short circuit somewhere in the lower left area of the capsule ignited the pure oxygen atmosphere. The fire spread with catastrophic speed. Within 15 seconds, the internal pressure of the capsule had risen high enough to rupture it. The 3 men had attempted to open the hatch. It opened inward, requiring a multi-step process that took at minimum 90 seconds under ideal conditions. But the fire was too fast. All 3 died within seconds of each other. It took outside technicians 5 minutes to open the hatch from the outside. By then, it was long over. The Apollo 1 fire was one of the most consequential disasters in the history of the space program. It killed 3 of the most experienced and respected astronauts in the program, and it exposed serious problems with the command module design and with the safety culture at NASA. Problems that had been known and tolerated in the rush to meet Kennedy's deadline. In the aftermath, the entire Apollo program was grounded for 20 months while the command module was redesigned. The hatch was changed to open outward and quickly. The pure oxygen atmosphere during ground operations was replaced. The miles of wiring were inspected and rerouted and insulated. Hundreds of combustible materials were replaced with fire-resistant ones. The program that had been running at maximum pressure was forced to stop, to examine itself, to fix what was broken. Gus Grissom, in the months before his death, had been vocal about his concerns about the Apollo command module. He had told his wife, Betty, that if there was ever a serious accident in the program, it would probably be him. He was right, and he was wrong. It was him, but it was also Ed White and Roger Chaffee. And it was also, in a different way, every person in the program who had to keep going in the knowledge of what had happened. They kept going. They had no choice. The commitment had been made. Rest here for a moment. Breathe slowly. Chapter 9. The Soviet Moon Program. The race no one admitted was a race. For years after the space race ended, the Soviet Union officially denied that it had ever been trying to reach the moon. There had been no Soviet moon program, the official line went. The Americans had been racing against no one. This was not true. The Soviet Union had a moon program. It was ambitious, well-funded, and for a significant portion of the 1960s, it was ahead of the American program. What it lacked, ultimately, was what the American program had in abundance: a single, unified management structure with clear authority, genuine accountability, and a rocket that worked. The Soviet program was divided between competing design bureaus, each led by powerful and often antagonistic chief designers. The most important of these was Sergei Korolev, the man who had designed the R-7, who had launched Sputnik, who had sent Gagarin to space, who was by any reasonable assessment the greatest rocket engineer of his era. Korolev had been imprisoned in Stalin's Gulag in the late 1930s, surviving years of brutal conditions that permanently damaged his health. He had emerged to build the Soviet space program from nothing. He worked in official anonymity. His identity was a state secret, known only as the chief designer, and he drove his teams with a ferocity and a vision that produced miracle after miracle. In January 1966, Korolev died on an operating table during what was supposed to be a routine surgical procedure. He was 59 years old. His death was a catastrophe for the Soviet lunar program. The man who had held everything together was gone. The program fragmented. The Soviet response to the Apollo program was the N-1 rocket, a behemoth with 30 first-stage engines, any one of which could fail and potentially cause catastrophic cascade failures. The N-1 was never successfully launched. It failed 4 times. The July 1969 failure, occurring just days before the Apollo 11 lunar landing, produced one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history when the N-1 fell back onto the launch pad. There were Soviet cosmonauts training for lunar missions. There were Soviet spacecraft. There were serious proposals to attempt a crewed loop around the moon before Apollo 8. The mission was ultimately not approved. If a Soviet cosmonaut had looped around the moon before Apollo 8, the history of the space race would look very different. But it didn't happen. The N-1 kept failing. Korolev was dead. And on the other side of the world, Apollo was beginning to fly. Chapter 10. Apollo 8, Earthrise. Settle in. Breathe slowly. December 1968. It had been a year of almost unrelenting darkness. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April, Robert Kennedy in June. The Democratic National Convention had been torn apart by violence in August. The Vietnam War was consuming 55,000 American lives. The country felt, to many of its citizens, like it was coming apart. And then, on December 21st, 1968, 3 men, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, climbed into an Apollo command module atop a Saturn V rocket and went to the moon. Not to land. Apollo 8 was conceived on short notice and with considerable risk, a decision made to send the first crewed spacecraft to the moon's vicinity, to orbit it 10 times, and to come back. The lunar module was not ready. The crew would be going to the moon with no way to land, and no means of returning to the Earth other than their own service module engine, which had to work perfectly the first time it was fired. 400,000 kilometers from any possibility of rescue. They flew for 3 days. On December 24th, 1968, Christmas Eve, they entered lunar orbit. They were the first human beings ever to see the far side of the moon. The hemisphere that always faces away from Earth, that had never been seen by human eyes before the space age. They orbited at an altitude of roughly 111 kilometers, close enough to see the surface in detail. The craters and the rills and the mountains and the vast gray plains. And then, as the spacecraft came around the limb of the moon on its 4th orbit, Bill Anders looked out the window and saw something that stopped his breath. The Earth was rising over the horizon of the moon. The small blue planet, brilliant with light, cloud-wrapped and vivid, hanging in the absolute black of space above the gray and desolate lunar surface. He photographed it That photograph, Earthrise, is one of the most famous images in human history. It showed the Earth as it had never been seen before, as a single, complete, isolated, fragile thing, suspended in the dark. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. The Earth rising over the grey horizon, small and blue and whole, floating in the absolute black of space. On Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 broadcast a television program from lunar orbit. An estimated 1 billion people watched. The 3 astronauts took turns reading from the opening verses of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The words fell into the silence of Christmas Eve. And then Frank Borman, signing off, said. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth. The year 1968, which had seemed so irredeemably dark, ended with 3 human beings orbiting the moon, reading Genesis, and sending back an image of the Earth that would change how humanity understood its place in the universe. Chapter 11. Apollo 11. We came in peace. Take a slow, deep breath. July 16th, 1969. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. The Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon was the largest, most powerful rocket ever built. It stood 111 meters tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. Fully fueled, it weighed approximately 3 million kilograms. Its 5 first-stage engines produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, burning 15 metric tons of fuel per second. The vibration at launch was so intense that observers miles away felt it in their chests, in their teeth, in their bones. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. 3 men rode it into the sky on a Wednesday morning in July, watched by an estimated 1 million people on the beaches around the Cape, by 600 million more on television around the world. 3 days later, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. On July 20th, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, a spindly, angular craft that looks, to modern eyes, barely adequate for the task it was designed to perform, and undocked from the command module, leaving Collins alone in orbit. Collins would orbit the moon 30 times while his crewmates descended, keeping the command module in order, maintaining communication, waiting for a return that was not guaranteed. The powered descent to the lunar surface took 12 minutes. 4 minutes in, the computer began flashing a program alarm, a code that neither Armstrong nor Aldrin had seen in training. In the back room at Mission Control, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales determined in seconds that the alarm indicated the computer was overloading, but not failing. It was shedding non-essential tasks to focus on the critical ones. Go. The descent continued. With less than a minute of fuel remaining, Armstrong took manual control and flew the lander over a field of boulders that would have made landing impossible, searching for a clear patch of surface. He found one. The contact light on the landing probes illuminated. At 4:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969, the Eagle landed. Armstrong's first words from the surface were practical, precise, directed at Mission Control. The Eagle has landed. There was a brief silence on the ground while the flight controllers processed what they had just heard. And then the voice of Charlie Duke, the capsule communicator. "Roger. Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You've got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." 6 hours later, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed backward down the ladder. He pulled a handle that deployed a small camera so that the world could watch. He reached the bottom rung of the ladder and paused, and then he stepped off. Onto the surface of another world. "That's one small step for man," he said. "One giant leap for mankind." The distance between the bottom rung of the ladder and the lunar surface, Armstrong estimated it at perhaps 35 centimeters, was somehow, simultaneously, the greatest distance any human being had ever traveled. Aldrin joined him 20 minutes later. Together they spent 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface. They planted a flag, specially constructed with a horizontal rod to keep it extended in the airless vacuum. They set up scientific instruments. They collected rock and soil samples. They received a telephone call from President Nixon, who called it the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. A claim that was, for once, not hyperbole. And they looked around at the desolate, beautiful, silent surface of the moon, pocked with craters, scattered with rocks, utterly still in the absence of any atmosphere to carry sound or movement. At the black sky above them, in which the earth hung like a small blue jewel. At the footprints they were leaving in the fine grey regolith, which would remain exactly where they left them, unchanged by any wind or rain, for millions of years. Aldrin described the view as magnificent desolation. 2 words that somehow contained everything: the barrenness and the beauty and the awe. Magnificent desolation. They returned to the lunar module. The ascent engine fired. There was only one with no backup, and carried them back to orbit. Back to Michael Collins waiting in the command module. Back toward the Earth. Left behind on the surface, the lunar module's descent stage, which had been their landing pad and their launch pad. The scientific instruments, the flag, and a plaque that read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969, A.D. We came in peace for all mankind." Chapter 12. The Later Missions. What Came After. Apollo 11 was the peak, the moment the goal was achieved, the thing the decade had been building toward. But it was not the end. There were 5 more successful lunar landings, each one more ambitious than the last, each one expanding what human beings could do on another world. Apollo 12 landed in the Ocean of Storms in November 1969. Pete Conrad, the shortest of the astronauts, stepped off the ladder and said with characteristic irreverence, "Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." Apollo 13 in April 1970 became the most dramatic near-disaster in the history of spaceflight. 56 hours into the mission, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded, destroying the service module's power and oxygen supply. A routine mission became a life-or-death emergency. The crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, used the lunar module as a lifeboat. They flew around the moon, not the landing they had planned, but a gravitational assist that put them on a trajectory back to Earth. Engineers and flight controllers worked around the clock, improvising solutions with the materials aboard the spacecraft. Gene Kranz, the flight director, gathered his team and told them, "Failure is not an option. The mission failed to land on the moon." The crew came home. It was the best possible outcome of an almost worst possible situation. And the collaborative problem-solving that made it possible was, in many ways, a more impressive demonstration of human capability than the successful landings. Apollo 14 returned Alan Shepard, the first American in space, now the oldest person to walk on the moon at 47, to the surface. He hit 2 golf balls with a makeshift club, saying one of them went miles and miles and miles in the reduced gravity. Miles and miles and miles. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 were the J missions, extended science missions, each carrying a lunar roving vehicle that allowed the astronauts to travel miles from the landing site. Apollo 15's Dave Scott and Jim Irwin drove through the spectacular landscape of Hadley Rill, a sinuous canyon carved by ancient lava flows. Apollo 17's Harrison Schmitt, the only professional geologist to visit the moon, found orange soil that turned out to be ancient volcanic glass, evidence of fire fountains erupting billions of years ago. Gene Cernan was the last human being to walk on the moon. On December 14th, 1972, before climbing the ladder of the lunar module for the last time, he said, "As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." He climbed the ladder. The ascent engine fired. Taurus Littrow was empty and silent again. That was December 1972. No human being has been back since. Chapter 13. The Legacy, What the Moon Gave Us. Breathe slowly here. The space race ended officially in 1975 with the Apollo-Soyuz mission, an American Apollo capsule docking with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in orbit. The 2 crews shaking hands through the docking tunnel in a gesture of cooperation that would have seemed incomprehensible during the height of the competition. What did the space race give us? The practical answer is long and largely overlooked. The Apollo program drove advances in miniaturized electronics, in software engineering, in materials science, in medical monitoring technology. The global GPS navigation system we use daily descends, in a direct technological lineage, from the navigation systems developed for the space program. The kidney dialysis machine was developed with NASA funding. Memory foam was invented for spacecraft seats. The cameras in your phone trace their heritage to cameras developed for space imaging. The scratch-resistant lenses in your glasses were developed for astronaut visors. All of this came from the effort to reach the moon. But the deeper legacy is harder to quantify. The images from space, Earthrise from Apollo 8, the blue marble photograph taken by the Apollo 17 crew on their way to the moon, changed how human beings understood their place in the universe and their relationship to their home planet. The environmental movement of the 1970s was shaped in part by the Apollo photographs, which made visible for the first time the fragility and the isolation of the Earth in space. The simple fact of seeing the Earth whole from outside, from another world. A kind of philosophical revolution that has not finished playing out. And then there is what it meant simply as a human achievement. 12 human beings walked on the surface of the moon. They traveled 239,000 miles from home in vehicles assembled by human hands from materials extracted from the Earth, guided by calculations performed by human minds. And they stepped out into the airless grey silence of another world and walked around and came back. They brought rocks. They set up instruments. They hit golf balls. They drove a rover across the lunar highlands. They left flags and plaques and footprints that are still there now, in the silence, in the dust, unchanged. The footprints will last for millions of years. Let that breathe for a moment. Millions of years. The flags have almost certainly been bleached white by solar radiation by now, the fabric disintegrating in the ultraviolet until only the metal pole and the horizontal rod remain. The scientific instruments ran for years, transmitting data back to Earth before being shut down. The descent stages of 6 lunar modules sit on the surface, their landing legs still in the footpads they settled into on the day they landed, their metal surfaces slowly being darkened and pitted by micrometeorites and solar particles. The moon remembers them. The regolith holds their footprints with the patience of stone. And whatever else the human race does or fails to do in the centuries to come, the fact will remain, written in the dust of another world, confirmed in the rocks brought back and still being studied in laboratories around the world. That for a brief, extraordinary period in the middle of the 20th century, human beings left the Earth and went somewhere else, and walked around in the silence of the universe, and came home. That happened. No one can take it away. It is in the record. Let your body settle now. Let the day grow quieter. And so our journey through the space race comes gently, slowly to its end. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the terrifying beep of Sputnik in the autumn of 1957, through the shock of Gagarin's orbit, and the courage of the Mercury astronauts, through the long grinding work of Gemini, and the grief of the Apollo fire, and the wonder of Earthrise, to the July day in 1969, when 2 human beings climbed down a ladder and stepped out onto the surface of another world. It was a story of competition and of fear, the Cold War fear that drove both superpowers to pour their resources into rockets and capsules and trajectories. But it was also a story of something that transcended the competition. The engineers who built the spacecraft, and the flight controllers who guided them, and the astronauts who flew them, they were not primarily motivated by geopolitics. They were motivated by the simple, irresistible human impulse to go where no one had been before, to find out what was there, to push the frontier further out. The moon was the destination. But the impulse to reach it was as old as the first human who climbed a hill to see what was on the other side. And what the moon gave back, beyond the rocks and the data and the technology, was a view. The view from the other side. The view of the Earth from outside itself. Small and blue and whole and alone in the dark. Let that image come back now, if it's still with you. The Earth, rising over the grey horizon of the moon, brilliant blue in the absolute black of space, small and fragile and impossibly beautiful. This has been nap-time knowledge. Thank you for traveling through the space race with me tonight. Let your body settle into the warmth and stillness of sleep. Let the day's noise dissolve. Let that image of the Earth, rising over the grey horizon, small and blue and whole, rest behind your closed eyes for a moment before sleep takes it. The footprints are still there. In the dust of the Sea of Tranquility, and the ocean of storms, and the Fra Mauro highlands, and the Hadley Apennines, and the Descartes highlands, and Taurus Littrow, still there, exactly as they were left, in the silence of a world with no wind to disturb them, no rain to wash them away. They will still be there when no one alive tonight can remember the men who made them. They will still be there, patient in the dust, long after the last person who watched it happen on live television is gone. We came in peace for all mankind. It says so on the plaque. And the moon keeps it in the quiet and the cold and the dark, because the moon has no reason not to. Sleep now. The stars are burning. The Earth is turning. Somewhere in the stillness of the lunar surface, the bootprints of 12 human beings are waiting, as they have waited for more than 50 years, for whoever comes next. Sleep now. And if you find yourself awake in the small hours, with that particular wait that sometimes comes in the quiet before dawn, remember this. Somewhere up there, right now, there are people. Not on the moon, not yet again, but aboard the International Space Station, orbiting the Earth at 28,000 kilometers per hour, circling the globe every 90 minutes, watching 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every day. 16 sunrises. Every single day. They are there because of everything we traveled through tonight. Because of Sputnik and Gagarin and Glenn and the Apollo fire and the 12 men who walked on the moon. Because once, in a brief and extraordinary decade, the human race decided that going was possible and went. The line that runs from Laika to the International Space Station to whatever comes next, the moon again, and then Mars, and then whatever comes after Mars, is unbroken. The story is not over. It has barely begun. Sleep now. The stars are burning. The Earth is turning. Sleep.